May 15, 1952. 12:01 a.m. A man sat in an electric chair at Reidsville State Prison in Georgia. His name was Charlie Morrison. He was 28 years old. In approximately 90 seconds, 2,000 volts of electricity would pass through his body and stop his heart. But what witnesses remembered most wasn't the moment of execution. It was the moment before. The guards reported that as they were strapping him into the chair, Morrison kept touching his throat. Not his neck, specifically his throat. His fingers kept moving to a white scar that cut across his skin from jaw to jaw. He touched it again and again, like he was trying to remember something. Or maybe trying to forget it. When one guard asked him about it, "That scar from your escape?" Morrison smiled sadly. "No," he said. "That's from when I learned my lesson." Then they put the hood over his head. This is the story of what that scar meant. Why a man spent his final 93 days in prison touching a mark that had been put on him 3 months earlier. And what it reveals about a system of punishment that goes beyond what any legal code can do. This is the story of how a scar becomes a warning. And how a warning becomes a prophecy. Charlie Morrison had been in prison for exactly 10 months when he decided to escape. He wasn't a long-term planner. He wasn't smart. But he was desperate, and desperation is its own kind of intelligence. Morrison was 27 years old. He'd killed a state trooper named Daniel Richardson in August 1951 outside Valdosta, Georgia. The trooper had pulled him over during a routine traffic stop. Morrison was running moonshine. The trooper was doing his job. The confrontation lasted maybe 3 minutes before Morrison panicked and put 2 bullets into the trooper's chest. They caught Morrison 3 days later. The judge gave him death by electric chair. Morrison had 3 months to live. He spent those 3 months in a cell at Reidsville, waiting, counting down, knowing exactly how his life would end. But something changed between the conviction and the execution date. Morrison realized he didn't want to die. Intellectually, he'd accepted it. But emotionally, physically, everything in his body was screaming at him to survive. So when the opportunity came, a transfer between facilities, a carefully orchestrated riot started by a prisoner named William Davies that was designed to create exactly 3 minutes of chaos, Morrison took it. He jumped from a moving prison bus. 2 other inmates jumped with him. All 3 were running in different directions within seconds. Morrison made it further than anyone expected. He made it all the way to New York City. 6 days of riding freight trains. 6 days of sleeping in rail yards. 6 days of stealing food and water and sometimes whiskey to quiet the voice in his head that kept saying he was still going to die, just in a different way now. By the time Morrison stumbled into Harlem on February 10, 1952, he transformed into something barely human. Filthy. Shaking from withdrawal. Desperately hungry. His mind was fractured, unable to focus on anything except the immediate need for money and transportation. He needed enough cash to get to Canada. Maybe $500. Maybe $1,000. Something that would let him disappear into Montreal or Toronto or some other place where Georgia's death warrant couldn't reach him. That need is what made him walk into my Johnson's dress shop on February 11 at 10:23 in the morning with a stolen gun in his hand and desperation in his eyes. My Johnson was 41 years old. She'd been married to Bumpy Johnson for 13 years. She'd learned things that most people never learn. She'd learned how to read people. How to recognize threats. How to understand what someone was capable of before they understood it themselves. When Charlie Morrison walked into her shop with the gun, Ma didn't see a hardened criminal. She saw a desperate young man who'd been running so long he'd forgotten why he was running. A man who was so focused on the next hour that he couldn't see past it. A man who didn't understand where he was or what rules he'd just broken by being there. "Empty the register," Morrison said. His voice cracked. His hand shook. Even his threat sounded like pleas. My looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw the sweat on his forehead. Saw the way his eyes kept darting toward the door. Saw the calculation happening in his brain. How fast can I get the money? How fast can I get out? Can I make it to the next block before someone calls the cops? She didn't do what most people would do. She didn't comply or scream or try to talk him into lowering the gun. She did something more dangerous. She told him the truth. You just made a terrible mistake, she said. Not threatening. Not angry. Just informative. Like she was telling him something he should already know but didn't. And she was right. He had made a mistake. Not the robbery. The location of the robbery. My walk to the telephone. She dialed. Someone picked up almost immediately. It's me, she said. I need you to tell him something. Tell him the roses need watering. The shop is closed early today. 7 seconds. That's how long it took for me to send a message that would reach Bumpy Johnson within 30 seconds. That's how long it took for the entire system of Harlem protection to activate. By the time police arrived at the shop, there were already 70 people on the street. By the time Captain Henderson showed up, there were 200. By the time Morrison realized what was happening, he understood that he'd walked into a situation that was far bigger than he could comprehend. He'd robbed a woman in her own shop in her own neighborhood. A neighborhood that had rules. An unwritten code that Morrison had never heard of, had never imagined existed, and now was trapped inside without understanding the language or the customs or the consequences. The standoff lasted 4 hours. Morrison kept the gun on my. The police kept their positions outside. The crowd kept growing. And through it all, I kept talking to him. Not trying to convince him to surrender. Just talking. Helping him understand what was about to happen. Why aren't you scared? Morrison asked her at one point. Because this ends the same way no matter what you do, I said. The only question is whether you're smart enough to surrender before my husband gets here. Morrison didn't know who her husband was. He'd never heard the name Bumpy Johnson. He didn't understand that he'd just taken hostage the wife of the most powerful criminal in Harlem. Didn't understand that in Harlem, touching the wife of a powerful man was one of the only crimes that had no statute of limitations and no legal consequence because the justice system didn't apply to it. The street justice did. What happens if I surrender? Morrison asked. You go back to Georgia, I said. You sit in a cell. You get executed clean. Quick. In about 3 months. What if I don't surrender? I looked at him with an expression Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. An expression that contained knowledge of what was about to happen. Not fear. Not anger. Just understanding. Then he decides how long you stay conscious, she said quietly. At 3:42 p.m., someone knocked on the door. Not police. Not authorities. Someone else. When Morrison looked through the window, he saw him. A man in a gray suit. Perfectly tailored. Shoes polished like mirrors. A fedora sitting at a precise angle. The man looked like he was heading to a business meeting. Except for his face. His face looked like something that had seen things that murder doesn't even register as significant anymore. Morrison, the man said from outside. His voice was quiet. Conversational. You've got 2 choices. Bumpy didn't shout. Didn't threaten. Didn't need to. Just stated facts. Choice 1, you open this door. You let my wife walk out. You don't hurt her. Not one hair. Then Captain Henderson arrests you. You go back to Georgia. They execute you. Quick. Clean. Pause. Choice 2, I come through this door myself. Morrison understood what choice 2 meant. He'd heard stories in prison about men who'd crossed Bumpy Johnson. The stories never ended well. What happened next wasn't complicated. Morrison opened the door. He put down the gun. He walked out with his hands raised. And Bumpy Johnson opened his straight razor and cut a line across Morrison's throat. Not deep. Not to the carotid artery. Not a killing cut. A message cut. A mark. A scar that would identify Morrison for the rest of his life as someone who'd broken the code. Someone who'd touched a protected woman and lived to remember it. 19 stitches. The scar tissue would be thick and ropey, a white line across his throat that would be visible every time he looked in a mirror. Every time he showered. Every time someone looked at him. And that scar meant something. It meant, you broke the rules. You lived. But you'll carry the mark of your mistake forever. Morrison was transferred back to Georgia on February 12, 1952. The cut on his throat was stitched up at Harlem Hospital by doctors who understood the code well enough not to ask questions about how he'd gotten it. About why a letter opener, which is what the official report said, had created such a precise line across his throat. He arrived at Reidsville State Prison with 92 days left to live. The other death row inmates asked about the scar immediately. What happened to your neck? Morrison told different stories to different people. Got in a fight during the escape. Caught himself climbing through a window. Got attacked by a guard. He never told the truth. He never said, I threatened Bumpy Johnson's wife, and Bumpy Johnson let me live just long enough to make it to the electric chair. Because the truth made him sound weak. Made him sound like a fool. Made him admit that everything the Klan had taught him about superiority and power was a lie. But every morning when the guards brought him to the showers, Morrison would touch the scar. His fingers would trace the line from his left jaw to his right. And he'd remember. What was the scar? Not just a wound. Not just a mark. It was a sentence. It was a punishment that the legal system couldn't deliver. It was a reminder that would last as long as Morrison lived, which turned out to be 93 days. Every person who saw the scar would ask about it. Every time Morrison had to explain it, or not explain it, which meant lying, he'd feel the weight of that lie. The weight of the truth he wasn't telling. The scar was Bumpy's way of making sure that Morrison understood what he'd done. Not just in a moment, but every single day for the rest of his life. Every time Morrison touched it. Every time he looked in a mirror. Every time someone new asked him about it. That's what separates street justice from legal justice. Legal justice is abstract. You go to court, you get convicted, you get a sentence. The punishment is removed from the crime. It happens in an institution, far from the place where the crime occurred. Street justice is personal. It follows you. It marks you. It reminds you every single day of what you did and what it cost. Reidsville State Prison executed 1 man per month on average. Morrison watched others go to the chair. Watched how they behaved on their final days. Watched how some went quietly and some went fighting and some went praying. He spent his final days in solitary confinement, standard procedure for death row inmates in the days before execution. No visitors. No communication. Just time to think about what he'd done and what was about to happen. One guard who worked in the prison during that period later recalled Morrison's behavior in the final week. He was touching that scar constantly, the guard said in an interview 30 years later. Like he was making sure it was still there. Like he was afraid it would disappear. He'd get this look in his eyes like he was remembering something, and then his hand would go to his throat. On May 14, Morrison was given his final meal. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread. Standard prison food made as good as the kitchen could make it. Morrison ate slowly. Not because he was savoring it, but because eating meant time was passing. Each bite brought him closer to midnight. He was asked if he wanted to make a final statement. He declined. Instead, he kept touching the scar. The guards came for Morrison at 11:55 p.m. on May 15, 1952. They walked him down the corridor toward the execution chamber. Other inmates on death row could hear his footsteps. They'd been down that corridor before him. They'd seen the chair. They understood what it looked like and what it felt like and what happened when the switch was pulled. Morrison didn't resist. Didn't beg for mercy. Just walked, one step after another, toward the end. When he arrived at the chair, the guards began the process. They strapped his wrists. They strapped his ankles. They attached the electrodes that would conduct 2,000 volts through his body. And as they were doing this, Morrison kept touching his throat. His fingers kept moving to the scar. The guard who strapped his right wrist later said Morrison's fingers were trembling. One guard leaned down and asked him a question. "That scar from your escape?" Morrison smiled. Just a small smile. Just a sad smile. "No," he said. His voice was quiet, but the guard heard it clearly. "That's from when I learned my lesson." The guard paused. He didn't fully understand what Morrison meant. But he wrote it down anyway, in his report, in the official record of the execution that would become a historical document. Then they put the black hood over Morrison's head. They placed the electrode cap on top. They connected the wires. At 12:01 a.m., the switch was pulled. 2,000 volts entered Morrison's body. His muscles seized. His body tensed against the straps. And 93 days after he'd touched Bumpy Johnson's wife, Charlie Morrison stopped being alive. The execution was recorded as routine. A successful operation. No complications. The condemned had cooperated. The procedure had gone smoothly. The guard who'd asked about the scar included Morrison's final statement in his report: "No, that's from when I learned my lesson." It would be read by exactly no one during Morrison's lifetime after his death. It would sit in a file in Reidsville's archives for 60 years before anyone bothered to look at it. What was the scar really? It was a message. It was Bumpy Johnson's way of saying, "You lived. I could have killed you, but I didn't. I let you live long enough to go back to Georgia and think about what you did. I let you live long enough to look in a mirror and see what you look like when you break the rules. But I also made sure that every single day until the moment you die, you remember. Because that mark on your throat doesn't fade. It doesn't go away. It gets uglier as time passes. It becomes more prominent. It becomes the first thing people notice about you. That's the punishment. Not death. But a living reminder of the mistake." The scar was also a message to everyone else. A message that said, if you touch what belongs to Bumpy Johnson, this is what you get. Not death, necessarily. But a mark. A permanent identification. A way of making sure that everyone you meet for the rest of your life will know that you're someone who broke the code. And in a place like Harlem, where reputation and status and respect are the only real currency, a mark like that is worse than death. People often wonder why Bumpy didn't just kill Morrison. Why cut him when he could have cut deeper? Why let him live? The answer is strategic. If Bumpy had killed Morrison, it would have been one more body. One more crime. One more situation that might require explanation to the police or the system. One more death that could potentially be connected back to Bumpy. But if Bumpy just marked him, if he made sure that Morrison would carry that mark for the rest of his life, then the scar itself became the punishment. The scar became the evidence. The scar became the warning to everyone else: this is what happens. And the scar was visible. Every time Morrison looked in a mirror, he'd see it. Every time someone new met him, they'd ask about it. Every time Morrison had to lie about where it came from, he'd be reliving the moment it was given to him. That's more punishment than death in many ways. Death is quick. Death ends it. But a scar is endless. It follows you. It marks you. It identifies you. That's why Bumpy chose to mark instead of kill. Because marking lasts longer than killing. Because a scar tells a story that the person carrying it has to live with every single day. The story of the scar is not just a story about punishment. It's a story about how systems of authority work outside of law. It's a story about how a man can exercise absolute power without ever needing to take someone's life. Charlie Morrison touched Bumpy Johnson's wife. That was the crime. It didn't matter that he had a gun. It didn't matter that he was desperate. It didn't matter that he was willing to die. Once he touched her, he broke a rule that had no statute of limitations and no possibility of forgiveness. And Bumpy Johnson's response, to mark him, to scar him, to make sure that every day for the rest of Morrison's life he would remember what he'd done, that response was more effective than anything the legal system could have done. The legal system sentenced Morrison to death. But Bumpy sentenced him to live with the mark. And Morrison lived with it. Lived with it for 93 days. Lived with it through his final meal. Lived with it as they strapped him into the chair. Lived with it right up until the switch was pulled and it didn't matter anymore because he was dead. But in those final moments, what did Morrison remember? Not the legal conviction. Not the trial. Not the sentence. He remembered the moment the razor cut across his throat. He remembered the mark. He remembered Bumpy Johnson's instructions, "You broke the code." Charlie Morrison was buried in an unmarked grave at Reidsville. No funeral. No family claimed the body. His remains went into the ground and were forgotten by everyone except the few people who'd known him. His story didn't make newspapers. There was no drama, no unusual circumstances. Just a death row inmate executed according to procedure. Just another man sitting in a chair while electricity stopped his heart. But the story of the scar spread. It spread through Harlem first. It spread through the prison system. It spread through the criminal underworld. It became a legend about what happened when you crossed Bumpy Johnson. Not that he'd kill you. But that he'd mark you. He'd make sure you carried the mark for the rest of your life. And that legend did more to protect the women in Bumpy's life than any amount of bodyguards or weapons could have done. Because everyone who heard the story understood, this is what happens. Not a quick death. But a permanent scar. A permanent reminder. Looking back at this story from the perspective of 2024, we might judge it harshly. We might say it was barbaric, that it violated the rule of law, that Bumpy Johnson was a criminal and a murderer and a thug. And he was. He was all those things. But we should also understand what the scar represented. It represented a system of authority that existed outside the legal system. It represented a community's ability to protect itself. It represented a punishment that was proportional and that communicated a message without requiring an institution to deliver it. And it represented something else, the fact that in Harlem in 1952, there were rules that mattered more than written law. Rules about respect. Rules about protecting the vulnerable. Rules about honoring the boundaries of other people's families and territories. Charlie Morrison broke those rules. And the scar was his permanent identification as someone who'd broken them. In the end, that's what the scar was. It was a mark of the code. A visible representation of an invisible system. A permanent reminder, carried until death, of what happens when you forget where you are and what the rules are. Morrison touched the scar every day for 93 days. And every time he touched it, he was remembering. Every time he touched it, he was understanding. Every time he touched it, he was learning the lesson that Bumpy Johnson had tried to teach him. You just made a terrible mistake. That's what the scar said. And Morrison understood it. And he carried it. Until the day they strapped him into the chair and the power flowed through his body and he became nothing. But the scar had already done its work. It had already communicated the message. It had already become the warning. It had already proven that in Harlem, in 1952, in a system that existed outside the written law, there were punishments worse than death. And that scar, that visible, permanent, impossible to hide scar, that was one of them.